The year is 1644. A peasant rebellion burns through the Forbidden City. Flames consume the Dragon Throne. An emperor takes his own life. The dynasty falls. But this isn't the first time. And it won't be the last. For 4,000 years, China has risen, flourished, decayed, and collapsed, only to rise again. Unity gives way to chaos. Chaos yields to a new order. The pattern repeats, driven by a single idea, the mandate of heaven. When rulers govern justly, heaven blesses them. When they fail, heaven withdraws its favor. This is the story of how that cycle shaped a civilization, and how it continues to this day. Long before emperors and dynasties, before the first character was carved into bone, the land waited. The Yellow River wound through northern China, carrying silt from distant mountains. Each spring, the river flooded. Each flood deposited rich soil across the plains. This gift of fertility drew people to its banks. Around 5000 BCE, small communities appeared along the river. They planted millet in the dark earth. They built simple homes, half buried in the ground for warmth. These were the Yangshao people, named for the village where archaeologists first discovered their painted pottery. Their bowls and jars bore swirling patterns, fish, geometric designs, symbols whose meanings we can only guess. The act of decoration suggests something beyond mere survival. It hints at a people who paused to consider beauty, who saw meaning in the world around them. The river gave, but it also took. Floods could wash away entire villages. Droughts could crack the earth and wither the crops. The people learned to read the seasons, to anticipate the river's moods. They developed rituals to honor the forces they could not control. Ancestor worship took root in these early communities. The dead were not gone, but transformed, capable of influencing the fortunes of the living. Offerings were made. Prayers were spoken. The boundary between the visible and invisible worlds remained thin. Around 3000 BCE, the Lushan culture emerged, building on what the Yangshao had begun. Their pottery was finer, thinner, so delicate it's called eggshell ware. Their villages grew larger and were surrounded by walls. The presence of walls tells us something changed. Resources became worth defending. Social hierarchies formed. Some families accumulated more than others. The seeds of civilization were taking root. The Lushan people practiced divination, seeking guidance from the spirit world. They heated animal bones until they cracked, then interpreted the patterns. This practice would evolve into one of China's most important contributions to human knowledge, writing. But that development lay centuries ahead. For now, life moved slowly along the Yellow River. Generations came and went. The river flooded and receded. Crops grew and were harvested. Children learned the ways of their parents. The rhythm of agricultural life shaped how people understood time, not as a line stretching forward, but as a cycle endlessly repeating. Spring planting, summer growth, autumn harvest, winter rest, birth, life, death, rebirth. In these early millennia, the foundations of Chinese thought quietly formed. The importance of harmony between human actions and natural forces. The reverence for ancestors and tradition. The understanding that the world operates in patterns, and wisdom lies in recognizing those patterns. These weren't written philosophies yet. They were simply the way people lived, the assumptions they carried as naturally as breath. The Yellow River continued its patient work, building the land grain by grain. The people continued theirs, building communities season by season. Neither the river nor the people knew they were preparing the stage for something unprecedented. A civilization that would endure for 4,000 years, surviving conquest and catastrophe, always returning to its essential patterns. The cycle was beginning, though no one yet understood what that meant. The stories say a great flood came, not the seasonal flooding the people knew and anticipated, but something catastrophic. Waters rose and refused to recede. Villages drowned, crops rotted. The people cried out for help. A man named Yu heard their suffering. He was an engineer, the stories tell us, though what that meant 4,000 years ago, we can only imagine. Yu studied the problem. His father had tried to stop the floods by building dams and walls, forcing the water back. It hadn't worked. The water always found a way through. Yu took a different approach. Instead of fighting the river, he would guide it. He dug channels and canals, creating pathways for the excess water to flow safely to the sea. For 13 years, the stories say, Yu labored. He passed his own home 3 times during those years, but never stopped to enter. His dedication was absolute, his focus unwavering. When the work was complete, the floods receded. The land dried. Crops could grow again. The people, grateful and amazed, made Yu their ruler. He became the founder of the Xia dynasty, China's first dynasty, if it existed at all. Here we encounter one of history's most intriguing questions. Did the Xia dynasty actually exist, or is it a legend that later generations created to explain the transition from prehistory to civilization? Ancient Chinese texts describe the Xia in detail. They list its kings. They describe its customs. They tell us it lasted for 4 centuries, from roughly 2070 to 1600 BCE. But for centuries, historians found no physical evidence to support these claims. Then, in 1959, archaeologists began excavating a site called Erlitou in Henan province. What they found was remarkable. The remains of a large Bronze Age settlement with palatial structures, bronze workshops, and evidence of a complex organized society. The timeline matched the legendary Xia dynasty. The location aligned with ancient texts. The level of sophistication suggested a culture capable of the achievements attributed to the Xia. Yet questions remain. No written records have been found at Erlitou. No inscriptions definitively link this site to the Xia of legend. Some scholars believe Erlitou represents the Xia dynasty. Others think it might be an early phase of the Shang dynasty, which followed. Still others suggest it was a separate culture entirely, later absorbed into Chinese historical memory as the Xia. The debate itself reveals something important about Chinese civilization. History mattered deeply to these people. They preserved stories, compiled records, and sought to understand their origins. Whether the Xia dynasty existed exactly as described matters less than what the stories tell us about Chinese values. Yu the Great succeeded not through force, but through patient observation and clever engineering. He served the people before himself. He earned authority through merit, not birthright. Though ironically, he then passed that authority to his son, beginning the hereditary system that would define Chinese governance for millennia. The Xia stories also introduce us to a pattern we'll see repeated throughout Chinese history. A virtuous founder establishes a dynasty. His descendants rule well for a time. Eventually, corruption sets in. The final ruler proves incompetent or cruel. The people suffer. Heaven withdraws its mandate. A new leader emerges to restore order, and the cycle begins again. Whether Yu the Great actually lived, whether the Xia dynasty was real or mythological, the pattern was established. The cycle had begun. And in the archaeological layers at Elitu, we can see evidence of what came next. A civilization mastering bronze, developing writing, and stepping from legend into history. Around 1600 BCE, the archaeological record grows clearer. The mists of legend begin to part. We enter the world of the Shang dynasty, and for the first time we can hear the voices of ancient China speaking directly to us. They speak through oracle bones, turtle shells, and ox shoulder blades, carefully prepared and inscribed with questions. The Shang kings sought guidance from their ancestors and the spirit world. Will the harvest be good? Should we attack our enemies? Will the queen give birth to a son? The questions were carved into bone. Then heat was applied. The bone cracked. The pattern of cracks provided answers, which were also recorded. These inscriptions, discovered thousands of years later, gave us the earliest confirmed examples of Chinese writing. The characters on oracle bones aren't primitive scratches. They're sophisticated symbols, part of a fully developed writing system. This suggests that writing had been evolving for some time before the Shang, though earlier examples haven't survived. The Shang script is recognizably ancestral to modern Chinese characters. A scholar today can look at a Shang inscription and understand portions of it. This continuity across 35 centuries is remarkable. A written conversation spanning millennia. But the Shang were more than scribes. They were masters of bronze. In their workshops, craftsmen created ritual vessels of stunning complexity and beauty. These weren't simple tools. They were works of art, cast using sophisticated techniques that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. The vessels bore intricate designs, mythical creatures with curling bodies, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow, faces that stared out with an intensity that still unsettles modern viewers. Bronze required resources and organization. Copper and tin had to be mined, transported, and combined in precise ratios. The casting process demanded specialized knowledge. This level of production tells us the Shang had developed a complex economy and social structure. They had rulers who could command labor, artisans who could master difficult techniques, and a belief system that made such elaborate ritual objects necessary. The Shang capital moved several times, but their final city, Yin, near modern Anyang, has been extensively excavated. What archaeologists found there paints a picture of a highly stratified society. At the top sat the king, who served as both political and religious leader. He communed with ancestors and spirits. He led armies. He performed rituals to ensure cosmic harmony. Below the king were nobles and warriors, then craftsmen and merchants, and finally the vast majority, farmers who worked the land. This hierarchy was rigid. Your birth determined your place. Yet the system provided stability. Everyone understood their role. The rituals reinforced the order. The ancestors watched over all. The Shang practiced ancestor worship with an intensity that shaped all of Chinese civilization to come. The dead weren't gone. They existed in another realm, but remained connected to the living. They could help or harm their descendants. Elaborate tombs were constructed for kings and nobles, filled with bronze vessels, jade objects, and sacrifices, both animal and, disturbingly, human. Servants and guards were buried with their masters to serve them in the afterlife. This practice troubles us now, but it reveals the Shang belief in continuity between worlds. War was constant during the Shang era. Inscriptions record campaigns against neighboring peoples. Bronze weapons gave Shang armies an advantage. Chariots, probably adopted from peoples to the west, added mobility and shock power. Yet for all their military might, the Shang dynasty would fall in the same pattern that would repeat throughout Chinese history. The last Shang king, according to later accounts, grew cruel and self-indulgent. He ignored his duties. He oppressed the people. Heaven's favor was withdrawing. A rival power, the Zhou, watched from the west and prepared to act. The mandate was about to change hands. In 1046 BCE, two armies met at a place called Muye. On one side stood the forces of the Shang dynasty, led by their king. On the other, the Zhou people from the western valleys, led by King Wu. The battle was brief. Many Shang soldiers, weary of their ruler's cruelty, switched sides or simply laid down their weapons. The Shang king fled to his palace, surrounded himself with his treasures, and set the building ablaze. The dynasty that had ruled for over 5 centuries ended in fire and smoke. The Zhou victory marked more than a change of rulers. It introduced an idea that would shape Chinese political thought for 3,000 years, the mandate of heaven. The Zhou needed to justify their conquest. They weren't the rightful heirs. They were outsiders who had overthrown an established dynasty. How could this be legitimate? Their answer was elegant and profound. Heaven, they declared, grants the right to rule, but only to those who govern justly and maintain harmony. A virtuous ruler receives heaven's mandate. He brings prosperity and peace. The seasons turn properly. The harvests are good. The people flourish. But when a ruler becomes corrupt, when he neglects his duties and oppresses his people, heaven withdraws its favor. Natural disasters occur. Rebellions arise. These aren't random events. They're signs that the mandate has been lost. The Shang king had lost the mandate through his cruelty and self-indulgence. The Zhou, by defeating him, proved they had received heaven's favor. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was a philosophical framework that placed moral limits on power. A ruler couldn't claim absolute authority. He served at heaven's pleasure, and heaven judged based on performance. If he failed, rebellion wasn't just justified. It was necessary to restore cosmic order. This idea would echo through Chinese history. Every dynasty that rose would claim the mandate. Every dynasty that fell would be seen as having lost it. The cycle became self-reinforcing. Success proved virtue. Failure revealed corruption. The pattern seemed as natural and inevitable as the seasons. The Zhou established their authority through a feudal system. The king distributed land to relatives and loyal followers, who became regional lords. These lords swore allegiance to the Zhou king and provided military support when needed. In return, they governed their territories with considerable autonomy. The system worked well initially. The Zhou expanded their influence, and Chinese culture spread across a wider territory than ever before. The early Zhou period, known as the Western Zhou, was marked by relative stability and cultural development. Bronze working reached new heights of artistry. Poetry and music flourished. The Book of Songs, one of China's oldest literary works, contains poems from this era, verses about love and loss, farming and festivals, war and peace. They reveal a society that valued ritual and propriety, that found meaning in tradition and ceremony. The Zhou kings performed elaborate rituals to maintain harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. These weren't empty gestures. They were seen as essential to cosmic order. If the rituals were performed correctly, if the king fulfilled his duties, then the world would function as it should. This belief in ritual as a force for maintaining order would become central to Confucian thought centuries later. But even the Zhou couldn't escape the pattern they had identified. In 771 BCE, nomadic invaders attacked the Zhou capital. The king was killed. The court fled east to Luoyang, beginning what historians call the Eastern Zhou period. The king's authority weakened. The regional lords grew more powerful and independent. They began fighting among themselves. The feudal bonds loosened. Unity gave way to fragmentation. The mandate hadn't been withdrawn entirely. The Zhou kings continued to rule in name for 5 more centuries. But real power had shifted to the regional states. China was entering a new phase. The age of philosophers and warriors, of brilliant ideas and terrible warfare. The cycle was turning once again. The Eastern Zhou kings ruled in name, but their power had become ceremonial. Real authority belonged to the regional lords, who now styled themselves as dukes and princes. They maintained the fiction of Zhou supremacy. They still sent tribute, still acknowledged the king's ritual authority. But they governed their own territories, raised their own armies, and pursued their own ambitions. China had fractured into dozens of competing states. This period, from 770 to 476 BCE, is known as the Spring and Autumn period, named after a chronicle that recorded events in the state of Lu. It was a time of constant maneuvering and occasional warfare, but the conflicts remained relatively limited. The states still shared a common culture. They spoke dialects of the same language. They practiced similar rituals. They recognized common rules of conduct, even when they broke them. Warfare itself was changing. The old aristocratic style of combat, nobles in chariots engaging in formal duels, was giving way to something more brutal and efficient. Infantry became more important. Armies grew larger. Iron weapons began replacing bronze, making military equipment cheaper and more widely available. The changes were gradual, but they pointed toward a future of total war. Yet this era of political fragmentation produced an unexpected flowering of thought. Perhaps because no single authority could enforce orthodoxy, perhaps because competing states sought any advantage, including philosophical wisdom, China's intellectual life exploded with creativity. Scholars traveled from court to court, offering their ideas to rulers who might implement them. This competition of ideas would later be called the 100 Schools of Thought. The most influential figure of this era was Confucius, known in the West as Confucius. Born in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, he lived during a time when the old certainties were crumbling. The Zhou rituals were still performed, but their meaning seemed hollow. The aristocracy claimed authority by birth, yet many proved incompetent or corrupt. The social order was breaking down. Confucius looked backward to find a way forward. He studied the classics, the poetry and history of the early Zhou period, when society had functioned properly. He believed that if people understood and practiced the rituals correctly, if they cultivated virtue and propriety, harmony could be restored. His philosophy centered on relationships, ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger, friend and friend. Each relationship had its proper conduct. Each person had their role. When everyone fulfilled their duties with sincerity and grace, society would flourish. This wasn't a call for blind obedience. Confucius taught that authority must be earned through moral cultivation. A ruler who governed unjustly forfeited the right to be obeyed. A father who acted without wisdom lost his claim to respect. The system was hierarchical, yes, but it was also reciprocal. Power came with responsibility. Confucius never achieved political success in his lifetime. He wandered from state to state, seeking a ruler who would implement his ideas. None did. He returned home, gathered students, and taught. His disciples preserved his sayings. After his death, his ideas spread slowly, quietly, like seeds carried on the wind. It would take centuries before Confucianism became state ideology, but the seeds had been planted. Other thinkers offered different visions. Laozi, a shadowy figure who may or may not have existed as a single historical person, taught the way of nature. The Tao, the underlying pattern of the universe, couldn't be grasped through study or ritual. It could only be experienced through simplicity and non-action. Let things be. Flow with circumstances. Don't force. The universe has its own wisdom. These ideas, Confucian order and Taoist spontaneity, would weave through Chinese thought for millennia, sometimes in tension, sometimes complementing each other. But their era of gentle philosophical debate was ending. The spring and autumn period was giving way to something darker and more desperate. The warring states period was about to begin, and the stakes would be nothing less than survival. As the spring and autumn period drew to a close, three schools of thought emerged that would shape not just China, but the entire course of human civilization. Each offered a different answer to the same question. How do we create order in a world falling apart? Confucius had already planted his seeds of virtue and ritual. His followers continued to develop his ideas, expanding on the importance of education, moral cultivation, and proper relationships. They believed that human nature was fundamentally good, or at least capable of goodness through learning. The path to a harmonious society lay in individual transformation. If each person cultivated virtue, benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and trustworthiness, then society would naturally flourish. The ruler should lead by moral example, not by force. His virtue would radiate outward, inspiring others to goodness. This was an optimistic vision, but it required patience. It required faith that people would respond to moral leadership, that education could transform society, that virtue was its own reward. In an age of increasing violence and cynicism, Many found this vision naive. Mozi offered a different path. Born sometime after Confucius, he looked at the philosophers' teachings and found them wanting. The problem with Confucianism, Mozi argued, was its emphasis on family and hierarchy. Confucius taught that you should love your parents more than strangers, your ruler more than distant kings. This graded love, Mozi believed, was the source of conflict. When people prioritized their own families and states, they inevitably came into conflict with others. Mozi proposed universal love, impartial care for all people. If everyone genuinely cared for everyone else as much as they cared for themselves, warfare would cease. Resources would be shared. Suffering would be alleviated. This wasn't mere sentimentality. Mozi was practical, almost utilitarian. He advocated for policies that benefited the greatest number. He opposed elaborate rituals and expensive funerals that wasted resources. He promoted frugality, hard work, and mutual aid. His followers, known as mohists, organized themselves almost like a military order. They traveled to states under attack and helped defend them, regardless of politics. They were engineers and philosophers, building siege defenses while debating ethics. For a time, Mohism rivaled Confucianism in influence. But its demands were high. Universal love required setting aside natural human preferences. Its ascetic lifestyle appealed to some, but not to many. Eventually, Mohism faded, though its ideas about impartial care and practical benefit would resurface in later Chinese thought. The third major school took a darker view. Legalism emerged from the chaos of the Warring States period, and it reflected that chaos. Legalist thinkers like Han Feizi argued that human nature was fundamentally selfish. People responded to incentives, rewards, and punishments. Moral education was a pleasant fiction. What actually worked was clear laws, strictly enforced. A state needed strong institutions, not virtuous rulers. Laws should be public, predictable, and harsh. Punishments should be severe enough to deter crime. Rewards should be generous enough to motivate service. The ruler should be mysterious and unknowable, revealing nothing of his thoughts, trusting no one completely. Officials should be monitored and controlled through a system of checks and mutual surveillance. This was government as machine, cold and efficient. It had no room for sentiment or mercy, but it promised results. In a world where states were being conquered and absorbed, where survival itself was at stake, legalism offered a path to power. These three philosophies, Confucian virtue, Mohist universal love, and legalist control, would compete and combine throughout Chinese history. Each contained partial truths. Each had its season. The question was, which would prevail when China's fragmentation reached its crisis point? When the Warring States period transformed philosophical debate into a desperate struggle for existence. The spring and autumn period ended not with a dramatic collapse, but with a gradual recognition that something fundamental had changed. By 475 BCE, the pretense of Zhou authority had worn thin. The regional states no longer paid even lip service to the king in Luoyang. They declared themselves kingdoms in their own right. China had fractured into 7 major powers: Qin, Chu, Zhou, Wei, Han, Yan, and Qi, along with several smaller states clinging to survival. This was the Warring States period, and the name tells you everything. The limited conflicts of earlier centuries gave way to total war. Armies swelled to hundreds of thousands. Battles lasted for months. Entire populations were mobilized. States that lost were absorbed completely, their ruling families extinguished, their people scattered or enslaved. The stakes couldn't be higher. Survival itself hung in the balance. Military innovation accelerated at a pace China had never seen. The crossbow became standard equipment, allowing common soldiers to kill armored nobles from a distance. Cavalry tactics, learned from nomadic peoples to the north, added speed and shock to warfare. Iron weapons became ubiquitous, democratizing violence in ways the Bronze Age never had. Siege warfare evolved into a science, with engineers designing towers, rams, and tunnels to breach city walls. But warfare wasn't just about weapons. It was about organization, logistics, and strategy. States developed sophisticated bureaucracies to manage taxation, conscription, and supply chains. They built roads and canals to move armies quickly. They established signal systems to coordinate across vast distances. War became industrial, impersonal, total. The human cost was staggering. Battles could claim tens of thousands of lives in a single day. The Battle of Changping in 260 BCE saw the state of Qin defeat Zhou, then execute 400,000 prisoners of war. Whether that number is accurate or inflated, it reveals the scale of violence that had become normalized. This wasn't combat between aristocratic warriors following codes of honor. This was annihilation. Yet, even in this age of iron and blood, the life of ideas continued. Perhaps especially in this age, rulers desperate for any advantage welcomed philosophers and strategists to their courts. Sun Tzu wrote, "The Art of War," a treatise on strategy that transcended its military origins to become a meditation on conflict itself. Know yourself and your enemy. Win without fighting if possible. Adapt to circumstances. The book would influence military thinking for millennia, but its deepest insights were about human nature and the nature of competition. The Warring States period also saw the full flowering of the 100 schools of thought. Confucians refined their ideas about virtue and ritual. Taoists explored the mysteries of nature and non-action. Mohists advocated for universal love and practical benefit. Legalists developed their theories of law and power. Each school competed for influence, and rulers experimented with different approaches, seeking any edge that might ensure survival. The state of Qin, isolated in the western mountains, watched and learned. They adopted legalist reforms under the guidance of Shang, a ruthless administrator who transformed Qin into a military machine. Land was redistributed based on military merit, not birth. Harsh laws were strictly enforced. The population was organized into mutual surveillance units. Individual freedom was sacrificed for collective power. The reforms worked. Qin grew stronger, while its rivals remained mired in traditional ways. By the 3rd century BCE, the pattern was clear. Qin was winning. One by one, the other states fell or submitted. The age of warring kingdoms was drawing to a close. But what would replace it? Would China remain a patchwork of competing powers, or would someone finally achieve what the Zhou kings had lost? True unity. The answer would come from the west, from the harsh mountains of Qin, and it would reshape China forever. The cycle was turning once again, and this time, the stakes were nothing less than the creation of an empire. In 221 BCE, the last rival state surrendered. For the first time in centuries, China was unified under a single ruler. Zheng, the king of Qin, stood victorious, but the title of king no longer seemed adequate for what he had accomplished. He needed something new, something that captured the magnitude of his achievement. He took the title Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. The name itself was a declaration. He wasn't just another king in a long line of rulers. He was the beginning of something unprecedented. He had ended the cycle of division and warfare. He would establish an order that would last, he believed, for 10,000 generations. The first emperor set about transforming his conquered territories into a true empire. The old feudal system, which had allowed the Zhou dynasty to fragment, was abolished completely. China was divided into administrative provinces, each governed by appointed officials who served at the emperor's pleasure. These weren't hereditary nobles with their own power bases. They were bureaucrats, rotated regularly to prevent them from developing local loyalties. Power flowed from the center, from the emperor himself. Standardization became the emperor's obsession. The conquered states had used different writing systems, different currencies, different measurements. This diversity hindered administration and trade. The emperor decreed uniformity. A single script would be used throughout the empire, the small seal script, which would evolve into the characters used today. A single currency would circulate. Weights and measures would be standardized. Even the axle width of carts was regulated so that vehicles could use the same ruts in roads throughout the empire. These reforms sound bureaucratic, almost mundane, but they represented a profound shift in how China understood itself. Regional identities were being subordinated to a larger whole. Local customs were giving way to imperial standards. China was becoming Chinese in a way it had never been before. The emperor's most visible project was the Great Wall. Earlier states had built defensive walls along their northern borders. The first emperor ordered these separate sections connected and extended into a single, continuous barrier. The goal was to protect settled China from the nomadic peoples of the steppes, particularly the Xiongnu, who raided with increasing frequency. The construction required enormous resources. Hundreds of thousands of workers, soldiers, peasants, convicts, labored on the wall. Many died from exhaustion, disease, or accidents. The wall they built wasn't the brick and stone structure tourists visit today. That came later, during the Ming Dynasty. The Qin wall was mostly rammed earth and wood, much of which has long since eroded. But the achievement was real. For the first time, China had a physical boundary, a line that said, "Here civilization ends, there the wilderness begins." Yet the first emperor's methods bred resentment. Legalist principles guided his rule. Laws were harsh, punishments were severe, dissent was not tolerated. In 213 BCE, scholars criticized his policies, arguing that he should learn from the past, from the way the ancient sage kings had ruled. The emperor's response was brutal. He ordered the burning of books, historical records, poetry, philosophical texts, anything that might encourage people to question his methods. Only practical texts on medicine, agriculture, and divination were spared. Scholars who protested were executed or buried alive. The book burning shocked later generations and became a symbol of tyranny. But the emperor saw it as necessary. The past was a source of dangerous ideas. People looked backward instead of forward. They compared his rule unfavorably to idealized golden ages. Better to erase that past, to make the present the only reality. The first emperor also feared death. He sent expeditions to find the elixir of immortality, legendary substances that could grant eternal life. Alchemists prepared potions for him. Ironically, these potions likely contained mercury, which slowly poisoned him. In 210 BCE, while on a tour of his empire, the first emperor died. He was 49 years old. His dynasty would not last even a generation beyond him. The first emperor's death created an immediate crisis. His chief advisor, the eunuch Zhou, concealed the death during the journey back to the capital. The emperor's body traveled in a sealed carriage, accompanied by a cart of rotting fish to mask the smell of decay. Zhou feared what would happen when the news became public. The designated heir, Fusu, was known for his moderate views and criticism of his father's harsh policies. If Fusu took the throne, Zhao Gao's influence would end. So Zhao Gao forged documents. He declared that the emperor had changed his mind, that Fusu should commit suicide, and that a younger, more pliable son should inherit the throne. The forgery worked. Fusu, dutiful to the end, took his own life. The new emperor, Qin Ershi, was little more than a puppet. Zhao Gao held real power, and he used it ruthlessly to eliminate rivals and enrich himself. But the empire was already fracturing. The first emperor's massive construction projects, the Great Wall, the roads, the palaces, his enormous tomb with its terracotta army, had drained the treasury and exhausted the population. Peasants had been conscripted for labor, torn from their fields. Taxes had climbed to oppressive levels. The harsh legal code meant that minor infractions carried severe punishments. Resentment had been building for years, held in check only by the first emperor's iron will and the efficiency of his bureaucracy. With his death, that restraint dissolved. In 209 BCE, a group of conscripted peasants realized they would arrive late to their assigned post. Under Qin law, tardiness for military service was punishable by death. They faced execution whether they continued or not. One of them, Shang, asked a simple question. If we're going to die anyway, why not die fighting for something better? The others agreed. They killed their officers and raised a rebellion. The uprising spread like wildfire. Chen Sheng's army swelled to tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Other rebel leaders emerged across the empire. Some were former nobles whose states had been conquered by Qin. Some were commoners who had suffered under Qin's harsh rule. All saw an opportunity in the empire's sudden weakness. The Qin government tried to respond, but the system that had been so effective at conquest proved brittle in crisis. The bureaucracy, built on fear and surveillance, turned on itself. Officials were more concerned with avoiding blame than solving problems. The army, stretched thin across the vast empire, couldn't be everywhere at once, and the new emperor, young and inexperienced, was no match for the challenges he faced. By 206 BCE, just 15 years after the first emperor had unified China, the Qin dynasty was finished. The capital fell to rebel forces. The imperial family was hunted down and killed. The empire that was supposed to last 10,000 generations had barely survived a single generation. Yet the Qin dynasty's legacy endured. The administrative structure, the standardized writing and measurements, the very idea of a unified China, these survived the dynasty's collapse. The next dynasty would learn from Qin's mistakes, tempering legalist efficiency with Confucian virtue. But they would build on Qin's foundations. The first emperor had been right about one thing. He had indeed begun something new. The cycle of Chinese history would continue, but it would never return to the fragmented world that existed before him. From the ashes of the Qin, a new power emerged, not from the old nobility, but from the humblest origins imaginable. Liu Bang had been a village official, a minor functionary responsible for escorting convicts to labor projects. One day, some of his charges escaped. Under Qin law, this meant death. Like Chen Sheng before him, Liu Bang faced a choice: die for someone else's failure, or risk everything for a chance at something better. He chose rebellion. But Liu Bang was no idealistic revolutionary. He was pragmatic, cunning, and remarkably good at reading people. While other rebel leaders fought for glory or revenge, Liu Bang focused on survival and advantage. He made alliances easily and broke them when necessary. He listened to advice from scholars and generals alike. He promised his soldiers rewards and delivered them. Slowly, methodically, he built a power base. His main rival was Shang, a nobleman whose family had served the old state of Chu. Shang was everything Liu Bang was not: a brilliant general, physically imposing, from an aristocratic lineage. He won battle after battle through sheer military genius and personal courage. For years, it seemed inevitable that Xiang Yu would reunify China and establish a new dynasty. But Xiang Yu had a fatal flaw. He was arrogant. He trusted his own judgment above all others and dismissed advice that contradicted his instincts. He alienated potential allies with his harsh treatment and unwillingness to share power. He was a magnificent warrior, but a poor politician. Liu Bang understood something Xiang Yu never grasped. Empires aren't built on battlefield victories alone. They require loyalty, administration, and the ability to convince people that your rule serves their interests. Liu Bang surrounded himself with talented advisors and actually listened to them. He made promises and kept them. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order. The final confrontation came at Gaixia in 202 BCE. Xiang Yu's army was surrounded, outnumbered, and demoralized. Liu Bang's forces sang songs from Chu, Xiang Yu's homeland, convincing the soldiers that their home had already fallen. In despair, Xiang Yu broke through the encirclement with a small group of followers, but found himself trapped by a river. Rather than surrender, he took his own life. The civil war was over. Liu Bang took the throne as Emperor Gaozu, founding the Han dynasty. He established his capital at Chang'an and immediately set about avoiding the mistakes that had destroyed the Qin. The harsh legal code was softened. Book burning ended. Confucian scholars who had been persecuted under the Qin were welcomed back. The new emperor recognized that ruling required more than force. It required legitimacy, and legitimacy came from governing in a way people could accept. Gaozu restored the civil service examination system, though in a simpler form than it would later become. Officials would be selected based on merit and education, not just birth or military achievement. This was revolutionary. It meant that a peasant's son, if talented and educated, could rise to positions of power. The system wouldn't be perfected for centuries, but the principle was established, Government should be staffed by the capable, not just the connected. The emperor also learned from the Qin's centralization. While maintaining strong imperial authority, he allowed some regional autonomy. Former allies were given kingdoms to rule, creating a hybrid system, part centralized empire, part feudal arrangement. It was a compromise, and like all compromises, it contained the seeds of future problems. But it bought stability in the short term, and stability was what China desperately needed. The Han Dynasty had begun. It would last, with one brief interruption, for over 4 centuries. The cycle had turned once more, and this time, the lessons of the past had been learned, at least for a while. The Han Dynasty's early decades brought stability, but it was Emperor Wu, ascending the throne in 141 BCE, who transformed stability into grandeur. His reign would last 54 years, long enough to reshape China's relationship with the wider world. The young emperor inherited a prosperous realm. The treasury was full. The population had recovered from decades of warfare. The bureaucracy functioned smoothly. But prosperity brought its own questions. What should China do with its wealth and power? Emperor Wu had an answer. Expand. His first concern was the Xiongnu, the nomadic confederation that had plagued China's northern borders for generations. These mounted warriors raided settlements, disrupted trade, and demanded tribute. Previous emperors had paid them off, buying peace with silk and gold. Emperor Wu decided to take a different approach. He would strike at the Xiongnu's heartland and forge alliances with peoples beyond China's borders who also suffered under Xiongnu dominance. In 138 BCE, the emperor dispatched an envoy named Zhang westward. His mission was to find the Yuezhi people who had been driven from their homeland by the Xiongnu and had settled somewhere in Central Asia. If Zhang Qian could convince them to ally with Han China, the Xiongnu could be caught between two enemies. The journey took 13 years. Zhang Qian was captured by the Xiongnu and held prisoner for a decade before escaping. He traveled through mountains and deserts, through kingdoms whose names the Chinese had never heard. He reached the Yuezhi, but they had settled into their new lands and had no interest in revenge. Zhang Qian returned to China in 126 BCE, his diplomatic mission a failure. Yet the journey was anything but a failure. Zhang Qian brought back knowledge of a world the Chinese had barely imagined. He described great cities in Fergana, Sogdiana, and Bactria. He spoke of peoples who bred magnificent horses, who grew crops China had never seen, who worked metals in unfamiliar ways. He mapped routes through mountain passes and across desert oases. Most importantly, he revealed that there were civilizations beyond China's borders that were wealthy, sophisticated, and eager to trade. Emperor Wu listened carefully. If China couldn't find military allies in the West, perhaps it could find trading partners. The emperor sent more expeditions, not to conquer, but to establish contact. Trade routes began to open, connecting China to Central Asia, and through Central Asia to Persia, India, and eventually the distant Roman Empire. The route became known as the Silk Road, though it was neither a single road nor exclusively about silk. It was a network of paths across deserts and mountains, through oases and trading cities. Merchants carried silk westward. The Romans paid extraordinary prices for this mysterious fabric they couldn't produce themselves. But the caravans also carried jade, spices, and lacquerware. On the return journey, they brought horses from Fergana, glass from Rome, precious stones from India, and ideas from everywhere. Buddhism traveled the Silk Road, carried by monks and merchants. It would arrive in China gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, but it would eventually transform Chinese spiritual life as profoundly as Confucianism had shaped its social order. New foods appeared in Chinese markets: grapes, pomegranates, walnuts. New musical instruments found their way into Chinese courts. The world was becoming connected in ways it had never been before. Emperor Wu's military campaigns against the Xiongnu achieved mixed results. He won battles and pushed them back, but he never destroyed them completely. The wars drained the treasury and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Yet the campaigns had an unintended consequence. They secured the Silk Road, making long-distance trade possible and relatively safe. The emperor's reign marked China's emergence as a power that looked outward, not just inward. The Middle Kingdom was discovering that it existed in a larger world, and that world was discovering China. The connections forged during Emperor Wu's reign would endure for centuries, surviving the fall of dynasties and the rise of new powers. The Silk Road became more than a trade route. It became a bridge between civilizations, and China stood at its eastern terminus, both shaped by and shaping the flow of goods, ideas, and peoples across the vast expanses of Asia. The Han Dynasty didn't just expand China's borders and trade networks, it transformed daily life in ways that would echo through millennia. The period saw innovations that seem mundane now, but were revolutionary then. Inventions that changed how people communicated, navigated, and understood their world. Around 105 CE, a court official named Kai Lun presented Emperor He with a new material. It was made from tree bark, hemp, old rags, and fishing nets, all pulped together and pressed into thin sheets. Paper. Before this, important documents were written on silk, which was expensive, or on bamboo strips, which were heavy and cumbersome. A single book could require dozens of bamboo strips bound together, weighing so much that a cart was needed to transport a small library. Paper changed everything. Knowledge became portable. Ideas could spread more easily. Government records could be kept more efficiently. The invention spread slowly at first. Silk and bamboo didn't disappear overnight. But within a few centuries, paper had become the standard medium for writing throughout China and eventually the world. It's difficult to overstate the importance of this development. Paper made the written word accessible in a way it had never been before. The Han also made remarkable advances in understanding the natural world. Zhang, a polymath who lived during the 2nd century CE, invented the first seismograph. It was an ingenious device, a bronze vessel with 8 dragon heads arranged around its circumference, each holding a ball in its mouth. Below each dragon sat a bronze toad with its mouth open. When an earthquake occurred, even one too distant to be felt, a pendulum inside the vessel would swing, causing one of the dragons to release its ball into a toad's mouth. The direction of the fallen ball indicated the direction of the earthquake. This wasn't magic or mysticism. It was careful observation of natural phenomena and clever engineering. Zhang understood that earthquakes created waves that traveled through the earth. and he designed a device sensitive enough to detect them. His seismograph couldn't predict earthquakes, but it could tell officials where one had occurred, allowing them to send aid more quickly. Medicine advanced as well. Physicians compiled extensive records of symptoms, treatments, and herbal remedies. They developed theories about the body's energy systems, what would later be called Qi, and how imbalances led to disease. Acupuncture emerged as a treatment, based on the idea that inserting needles at specific points could restore balance and health. These practices would spread throughout East Asia and, much later, to the wider world. Mathematics flourished. The 9 chapters on the mathematical art, compiled during the Han Dynasty, contained problems and solutions covering everything from land surveying to taxation to engineering. Chinese mathematicians developed methods for solving systems of linear equations, calculating square and cube roots, and understanding geometric relationships. This mathematical knowledge supported the empire's administrative needs, calculating taxes, dividing land, planning construction projects. But it also represented a desire to understand the underlying patterns of the world. Astronomy received imperial patronage. Court astronomers carefully observed the heavens, tracking the movements of planets and stars, recording eclipses and comets. This wasn't idle curiosity. The emperor's legitimacy depended partly on maintaining cosmic harmony. Unusual celestial events could be interpreted as signs of heaven's displeasure. Accurate astronomical observations helped the court anticipate and explain these events, maintaining the emperor's authority. Poetry and historical writing reached new heights. Sima Qian completed his records of the Grand Historian, a monumental work that chronicled Chinese history from its legendary beginnings to his own time. It set the standard for historical writing in China, establishing the idea that each dynasty should compile an official history of its predecessor. The practice would continue for 2,000 years. The population grew dramatically during the Han period, reaching perhaps 60 million people by the dynasty's end. Cities expanded. Trade flourished. New crops and farming techniques increased food production. China was prosperous, confident, and culturally vibrant. Yet prosperity contained its own dangers. Success bred complacency. The bureaucracy grew bloated and corrupt. Court intrigue intensified. And from the west, along those same Silk Road routes that had brought wealth and exotic goods, something else was traveling eastward. Buddhism, a foreign religion that would challenge and ultimately transform Chinese spiritual life. The Han Dynasty's golden age was approaching its twilight, and the cycle was preparing to turn once more. Buddhism arrived in China quietly, carried by merchants and monks along the Silk Road. At first it seemed exotic, foreign, perhaps even incomprehensible. The Chinese had their own spiritual traditions, ancestor worship, Confucian ethics, Taoist philosophy. What need did they have for teachings from India about suffering and enlightenment? Yet Buddhism offered something the traditional systems didn't quite address: consolation. It spoke directly to human suffering, acknowledging pain as a fundamental part of existence rather than something to be managed through ritual or accepted through duty. It promised liberation, not through social harmony or natural spontaneity, but through understanding the nature of reality itself. For a population weary from decades of prosperity that somehow felt hollow, Buddhism's message resonated. The religion spread slowly through the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, taking root in communities along the trade routes before moving deeper into China. Monks established monasteries. Texts were translated, though the translators struggled to find Chinese equivalents for Sanskrit concepts. Nirvana became extinction. Dharma became the way. The translations were imperfect, but they conveyed enough meaning to intrigue Chinese intellectuals. By the late Han period, Buddhism had gained a foothold, particularly among the educated classes who found in it a philosophy that complemented rather than contradicted their existing beliefs. Taoists saw parallels between Buddhist meditation and their own practices of inner cultivation. Confucians appreciated Buddhism's ethical teachings, even if they questioned its emphasis on monasticism and withdrawal from family obligations. But while Buddhism quietly transformed Chinese spiritual life, the political structure was crumbling. The cycle that had destroyed previous dynasties was repeating itself once again. The pattern was familiar. A strong founding emperor, a period of prosperity and expansion, then gradual decay as power concentrated in the wrong hands. Court eunuchs gained influence during the late Han. These castrated men, who served in the inner palace where other men couldn't enter, became intermediaries between emperors and the outside world. Some were capable administrators, others were corrupt, using their proximity to power for personal gain. They formed factions, allied with empresses and princes, and manipulated succession to maintain their influence. The bureaucracy, once a model of efficiency, became a battleground for competing interests. Scholars who had earned their positions through examination found themselves blocked by court favorites. Regional governors, appointed to serve the empire, began building personal power bases. The system that had made the Han great was turning against itself. In 184 CE, a massive peasant rebellion erupted. The Yellow Turban Rebellion, named for the cloth its followers wore, was led by Zhang, a faith healer who claimed divine powers. He promised his followers that a new age was coming, that the corrupt Han dynasty would fall and be replaced by a just order. Hundreds of thousands joined his movement. The government eventually suppressed the rebellion, but the cost was enormous. To defeat the Yellow Turbans, the court had to rely on regional warlords, granting them military authority that they would never fully relinquish. The empire had fractured in all but name. By 220 CE, the last Han emperor abdicated. The dynasty that had ruled for over 4 centuries, that had expanded China's borders and connected it to the wider world, was finished. The mandate had been withdrawn. What followed was not a new unified dynasty, but a return to division, the era of the 3 kingdoms, when China would once again be torn apart by competing powers, each claiming the right to rule. The cycle continued its eternal turn. The fall of the Han didn't bring immediate chaos. Instead, it brought something stranger, a division so clean it seemed almost inevitable. 3 kingdoms emerged from the empire's fragments, each led by a remarkable figure, each claiming legitimacy, each convinced it would reunify China under its banner. In the north, the state of Wei controlled the Yellow River Valley and the old Han heartlands. Its founder, Cao Cao, had been one of the warlords who suppressed the Yellow Turban Rebellion. He was a brilliant strategist and a capable administrator, but also ruthless and pragmatic. Cao Cao never claimed the imperial throne himself. He died in 220 CE, just months before the last Han emperor abdicated. But his son, Cao Pi, did, declaring the Wei dynasty and establishing his capital at Luoyang. In the southwest, the state of Shu occupied the fertile Sichuan basin, protected by mountains on all sides. Its founder, Liu Bei, claimed descent from the Han imperial family. This connection, however tenuous, gave him a certain legitimacy in the eyes of those who mourned the Han's fall. Liu Bei presented himself as the rightful heir, the man who would restore the dynasty rather than replace it. His kingdom was smaller and less populated than Wei, but its natural defenses made it difficult to conquer. In the southeast, the state of Wu controlled the Yangtze River Delta and the southern coast. Sun Quan, its ruler, came from a family of military leaders who had built their power base during the late Han period. Wu was wealthy from trade and agriculture, and its navy dominated the Yangtze, making any northern invasion costly and dangerous. These three states existed in a delicate balance. Wei was the strongest militarily and controlled the most territory, but it couldn't conquer both rivals simultaneously. Shu and Wu, recognizing their common danger, formed an alliance against Wei. This alliance held more or less for decades. The period saw constant warfare, but also moments of remarkable statesmanship and strategy. The Battle of Red Cliffs in 208 CE, fought before the formal division into three kingdoms, became legendary. Cao Cao led a massive army southward, intent on conquering the Yangtze Valley. His forces outnumbered the combined armies of Liu Bei and Sun Quan by a significant margin. Victory seemed certain. But the southern commanders used fireships, vessels packed with flammable materials and set ablaze, to destroy Cao Cao's fleet. The northern army, unfamiliar with naval warfare and weakened by disease, was routed. The battle demonstrated that numerical superiority wasn't everything, that clever tactics and understanding of terrain could overcome raw power. The Three Kingdoms period produced figures who became legendary in Chinese culture. Zhuge Liang, Liu Bei's chief strategist, was remembered as a genius of planning and invention. Guan Yu, Liu Bei's sworn brother, became deified as a god of war and loyalty. These men weren't just historical figures. They became archetypes, embodiments of virtue and capability. Yet, for all the drama and heroism, the Three Kingdoms period was also a time of immense suffering. The population of China declined dramatically, some estimates suggest by half or more, due to warfare, famine, and disease. Entire regions were depopulated. Cities were destroyed and abandoned. The constant mobilization for war disrupted agriculture and trade. The stalemate couldn't last forever. In 263 CE, Wei conquered Shu, eliminating one of the Three Kingdoms. But Wei itself was weakening from within. In 265 CE, a general named Sima Yan usurped the Wei throne and declared the Jin Dynasty. In 280 CE, the Jin conquered Wu, finally reunifying China after 6 decades of division. The cycle had turned once more. Unity had been restored. But the Jin dynasty would prove fragile, and China would soon descend into an even longer period of fragmentation. The Three Kingdoms period, brief as it was, left an indelible mark on Chinese culture, a reminder that even in division, Even in chaos, there could be honor, strategy, and meaning. The Jin dynasty's reunification of China in 280 CE seemed to promise a return to stability. After decades of division, the empire was whole again. But the unity was illusory, fragile as morning frost. Within a generation, China would fracture once more, this time into a chaos so profound that it would last nearly 3 centuries. The trouble began, as it so often did, within the imperial family itself. The War of the Eight Princes erupted in 291 CE, pitting members of the royal house against each other in a brutal struggle for control. These weren't philosophical disputes or policy disagreements. This was naked ambition, cousin against cousin, each commanding armies, each willing to devastate the empire to claim the throne. The war lasted 16 years. By the time it ended, the Jin dynasty's authority had evaporated. The military commanders who'd been called upon to fight in the civil war now had armies loyal to them personally, not to the emperor. The empire existed on paper, but real power belonged to whoever could hold it by force. Then came the invasions. Nomadic peoples from beyond China's northern frontiers, the Xiongnu, the Jie, the Di, the Qiang, saw opportunity in the empire's weakness. They had been raiding the borders for generations, but now they pushed deeper, establishing their own kingdoms on Chinese soil. In 316 CE, the Jin capital of Luoyang fell. The emperor was captured and later executed. The Western Jin dynasty was finished. What followed was the period known as the 16 Kingdoms in the north, though the number varied as states rose and fell with dizzying speed. Some lasted decades. Others barely survived a few years before being conquered or absorbed. The map of northern China became a constantly shifting mosaic of competing powers, each claiming legitimacy, none able to establish lasting control. The Jin royal family fled south, establishing a new capital at Jiangkang and continuing to claim imperial authority as the Eastern Jin. But they controlled only the Yangtze River Valley and the southern territories. The north was lost, ruled by non-Han peoples who adopted Chinese administrative practices, even as they maintained their own cultural identities. This division, North and South, foreign rulers, and Han Chinese, would define the next 3 centuries. The period is known as the Northern and Southern Dynasties, and it represents one of the longest stretches of political fragmentation in Chinese history. Yet paradoxically, it was also a time of remarkable cultural vitality. Buddhism flourished during these chaotic centuries. Perhaps it was the very instability that made the religion's message appealing. When the social order collapses, when dynasties rise and fall within a generation, when warfare and famine are constant companions, the Buddhist teaching that all things are impermanent doesn't seem abstract. It seems obvious. Monasteries offered refuge, both spiritual and physical. Monks translated sutras, built temples, and debated philosophy. The religion that had arrived as a foreign curiosity was becoming deeply Chinese. Art evolved in new directions. Painters explored landscape as subject matter, not just background. Calligraphy became increasingly refined, each brush, stroke, an expression of the writer's inner state. Poetry took on new forms, more personal and introspective than the formal verse of earlier eras. The division also spurred technological and agricultural development. The South, which had been relatively undeveloped during the Han Dynasty, now became China's economic center. Rice cultivation expanded. New irrigation techniques were developed. The Yangtze Delta transformed into a breadbasket capable of supporting large populations. In the north, the interaction between Han Chinese and nomadic peoples created a unique hybrid culture. Chinese administrative techniques merged with steppe military traditions. Intermarriage became common among the elite. The boundaries between conqueror and conquered blurred over time. The period was messy, violent, and uncertain, yet it was also creative, adaptive, and surprisingly resilient. China was divided, but Chinese civilization continued. Ideas spread, technologies developed, culture evolved. The empire might have fractured, but something deeper, a sense of shared identity, shared history, shared aspiration, endured. The cycle would eventually turn toward unity again, but the centuries of division left their mark, enriching Chinese civilization in ways that unity alone never could have achieved. During the centuries of division, while dynasties rose and fell with bewildering speed, Buddhism quietly transformed Chinese spiritual life. The religion had arrived centuries earlier as an exotic curiosity from India, its concepts strange and difficult to translate. But now, in an age when political stability seemed impossible, when the old certainties had crumbled, Buddhism's message found fertile ground. The religion offered something the traditional philosophies struggled to provide: an explanation for suffering that didn't depend on social order or cosmic harmony. Confucianism taught that proper relationships and virtuous conduct would create a harmonious society. Taoism suggested that aligning with nature's spontaneous flow would bring peace. But what did these teachings mean when society itself was chaos? When proper relationships were shattered by war? When nature seemed indifferent to human suffering? Buddhism acknowledged suffering as fundamental to existence. The first noble truth didn't promise that suffering could be avoided through better government or deeper wisdom. It simply stated, life is suffering. Birth is suffering. Death is suffering. The separation from what we love is suffering. The presence of what we hate is suffering. This wasn't pessimism. It was honesty. And for people living through centuries of warfare and instability, that honesty was liberating. Monasteries became centers of learning and culture. Monks didn't just pray and meditate. They translated texts, debated philosophy, and created art. The great cave temples carved into cliff faces during this period, Yonggang, Longmen, Mogao, stand as testaments to Buddhism's cultural impact. These weren't just religious sites. They were repositories of knowledge, galleries of art, and symbols of devotion that transcended political boundaries. The cave temples reveal how Buddhism adapted to Chinese sensibilities. The Buddha figures carved into stone combined Indian iconography with Chinese artistic traditions. The flowing robes, the serene expressions, the poses, all showed a blending of cultures. Buddhism wasn't replacing Chinese civilization. It was becoming part of it. Pilgrims traveled the Silk Road to India, seeking original texts and deeper understanding. The journey was dangerous, crossing deserts and mountains, passing through kingdoms that might be hostile or welcoming depending on the season. Many pilgrims died along the way. But those who returned brought back sutras, relics, and stories that enriched Chinese Buddhism and connected China to the wider Buddhist world stretching from India to Central Asia. The religion also offered a new kind of community, In an age when family ties might be severed by war and political loyalty could shift with each new dynasty, Buddhist monasteries provided stability. They welcomed people regardless of social class or ethnic background. A monastery in the north, ruled by nomadic peoples, functioned much like one in the south under Han Chinese dynasties. Buddhism created connections that transcended the political divisions fragmenting China. Wealthy patrons funded temple construction and supported monks. This wasn't just piety, it was also a form of cultural investment. A beautiful temple enhanced a city's prestige. Supporting monks earned merit and demonstrated sophistication. Buddhism became intertwined with elite culture, even as it remained accessible to common people seeking solace. The philosophical debates between Buddhist schools grew increasingly sophisticated. Chinese monks didn't simply accept Indian teachings wholesale. They questioned, adapted, and developed new interpretations suited to Chinese thought. The result was a uniquely Chinese Buddhism, one that would eventually spread to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, carrying with it centuries of Chinese philosophical refinement. As the age of fragmentation continued, Buddhism provided something rare and precious: continuity. Dynasties might fall, but the Dharma remained. Emperors might change, but the monasteries endured. In a world of constant flux, Buddhism offered an anchor, not through political power, but through spiritual practice and cultural creativity. The golden age of Chinese Buddhism had arrived, and its influence would shape Chinese civilization for millennia to come. By the late 6th century, China had been divided for nearly 300 years. The North and South had developed distinct identities, different economies, separate cultural traditions. The idea of unity seemed almost quaint, a memory from a distant past. Yet one man believed reunification was not just possible, but inevitable. Young Jian had served as a general and minister in the northern Zhou dynasty, one of the succession of states that had ruled northern China during the long period of division. He was capable, ambitious, and patient. When the northern Zhou emperor died in 580 CE, leaving a young child on the throne, Yang Jian saw his moment. He maneuvered carefully, building support among military commanders and bureaucrats. In 581 CE, he usurped the throne and declared himself Emperor Wen of the Sui dynasty. The northern states fell quickly under his control. Yang Jian's military was strong, his administration efficient. But the real challenge lay to the south, where the Chen dynasty ruled from Jiankang. The south was wealthy, its economy built on rice cultivation and maritime trade. Its culture was sophisticated, its scholars proud of their literary traditions. The southerners viewed the north as barbarous, tainted by centuries of nomadic rule. Emperor Wen prepared methodically. He didn't just build armies, he built a case for legitimacy. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a unifier, someone who would restore the natural order that had been disrupted for too long. He emphasized Confucian virtues: benevolence, righteousness, proper governance. He patronized Buddhism, which had followers throughout both North and South. He was creating a narrative that transcended regional identity. In 589 CE, the Sui armies crossed the Yangtze. The Chen dynasty, weakened by internal corruption and complacent in its long security, collapsed quickly. The last Chen emperor was captured and brought north. For the first time in nearly 3 centuries, China was unified under a single ruler. Emperor Wen set about consolidating his victory. He knew that military conquest alone wouldn't create lasting unity. The North and South needed to be connected, integrated, made interdependent. His answer was infrastructure: roads, canals, granaries. The most ambitious project was the Grand Canal, a waterway that would eventually stretch over 1,000 miles, connecting the Yellow River in the north with the Yangtze in the south. The canal wasn't just about transportation, though moving grain from the fertile south to feed the northern armies and cities was crucial. It was about creating physical connections between regions that had been separate for generations. Boats traveling the canal carried goods, but also ideas, people, and a growing sense that North and South belonged to a single whole. Emperor Wen also reformed the bureaucracy, standardizing laws and administrative procedures across the empire. He revived and expanded the civil service examination system, creating a path for talented men from both North and South to serve in government. The examinations weren't perfect. They favored those with access to education, but they established the principle that merit, not just birth or regional origin, should determine who governed. The Sui dynasty's reunification seemed miraculous. After 3 centuries of division, China was whole again. But the achievement came at a cost. The massive construction projects required enormous labor. Peasants were conscripted, pulled from their fields to dig canals and build roads. Taxes rose to fund the emperor's ambitions. The very projects that were meant to strengthen the empire were exhausting it. Emperor Wen died in 604 CE, and his son, Emperor Yang, inherited both the unified empire and its mounting problems. The cycle was turning once more, and the Sui dynasty's time was running short. Emperor Yang's ambitions destroyed the Sui dynasty faster than anyone could have predicted. His obsession with military glory led to disastrous campaigns against the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo. 3 massive invasions, each one larger and more costly than the last, all ended in failure. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died in the frozen mountains and marshlands of Korea. The treasury, once full from his father's careful management, was emptied. Meanwhile, the Grand Canal and other construction projects continued to drain resources and exhaust the population. Peasants were conscripted for labor, torn from their fields during planting and harvest seasons. Famine spread across regions that should have been prosperous. Resentment built like water behind a dam, and in 617 CE, the dam broke. Rebellions erupted across the empire. Local officials declared independence. Military commanders turned on the court. The Sui dynasty, which had seemed so solid just a decade earlier, dissolved into chaos. Emperor Yang fled south, seeking refuge in Yangzhou. In 618 CE, he was assassinated by his own guards. The dynasty that had reunified China after 3 centuries of division had lasted barely 40 years. From this chaos emerged Li Yuan, a general and aristocrat who had served the Sui, but recognized the dynasty's collapse as inevitable. He was pragmatic, experienced, and well-connected. More importantly, he had a remarkably capable son named Li Shimin, whose military genius and political acumen would prove crucial in the coming years. Li Yuan moved carefully. He didn't immediately declare himself emperor. Instead, he placed a puppet Sui prince on the throne while consolidating his power base. He secured the support of key military commanders and regional leaders. He presented himself as a restorer of order, not a usurper. Only when his position was unassailable did he take the throne in 618 CE, founding the Tang Dynasty and establishing his capital at Chang'an. The early Tang faced the same challenge as the Sui: how to maintain unity after conquest. Li Yuan, now Emperor Gaozu, learned from the Sui's mistakes. He reduced taxes and eased the burden of labor conscription. He allowed time for the empire to recover from decades of warfare and overwork. He focused on stability rather than grand projects or foreign adventures. But it was his son, Li Shimin, who would truly establish the Tang dynasty's greatness. In 626 CE, a power struggle erupted between Li Shimin and his brothers. The conflict came to a head at the Xuanwu Gate of the Imperial Palace. Li Shimin, acting preemptively, killed his brothers and forced his father to abdicate. It was brutal, but it was also decisive. The throne couldn't be divided. Unity required a single strong ruler. Li Shimin took the throne as Emperor Taizong, and his reign would become the model of good governance in Chinese history. He was a military genius who had won the battles that established the Tang. But he was also a thoughtful administrator who understood that maintaining an empire required different skills than conquering one. Emperor Taizong perfected the civil service examination system, making it the primary path to government office. He recruited talented advisors regardless of their backgrounds and actually listened to their counsel. He encouraged honest criticism, creating a political culture where officials could speak truth to power without fear of execution. This was revolutionary in a system built on imperial authority. The emperor also recognized that China's security depended on managing relationships with the nomadic peoples beyond its borders. Rather than simply building walls or launching costly military campaigns, he used a combination of diplomacy, strategic marriages, and selective military action. The Turks, who had threatened China's northern borders for generations, were defeated and incorporated into the Tang system. Emperor Taizong even took the title of Heavenly Khagan, acknowledging his rule over both settled Chinese and nomadic peoples. Chang'an grew into the world's largest and most cosmopolitan city. Its market sold goods from across Asia. Its streets were walked by merchants from Persia, monks from India, diplomats from distant kingdoms. The Tang dynasty had begun not just as another Chinese dynasty, but as something larger, a multicultural empire that would define what it meant to be civilized in East Asia. The 7th and 8th centuries marked the Tang dynasty's zenith, a period when China's influence stretched further than it ever had before. The empire's borders expanded deep into Central Asia, encompassing the oasis cities along the Silk Road: Kashgar, Samarkand, Bukhara. These weren't just military conquests. They were the culmination of diplomatic finesse, economic power, and cultural prestige that made Chinese civilization irresistible to its neighbors. The Silk Road flourished under Tang protection. Caravans moved with relative safety through territories that had once been perilous. The trade wasn't merely in goods, silk flowing westward, horses and glassware coming east, but in ideas, religions, and artistic traditions. Nestorian Christians established churches in Chang'an. Zoroastrian fire temples stood alongside Buddhist monasteries. Persian merchants settled in Chinese cities, bringing their music, their foods, their stories. The Tang capital became a place where the world's cultures mingled freely, where a person could hear half a dozen languages spoken in a single marketplace. This cosmopolitanism extended to the imperial court itself. Foreigners served as generals, advisors, and officials. The Tang didn't see diversity as a weakness to be managed, but as a strength to be cultivated. The empire's power came partly from its ability to absorb and integrate different peoples, to make them stakeholders in Tang's success. Poetry reached heights it would never quite achieve again. Li Bai wandered through the empire, writing verses that captured the beauty of mountains and rivers, the melancholy of separation, the joy of wine and friendship. His poems felt spontaneous, effortless, as if they flowed directly from nature itself. Du Fu, his contemporary, wrote with different concerns: the suffering of common people, the devastation of war, the responsibilities of power. His poetry was more structured, more political, but equally profound. Together, these two poets defined what Chinese poetry could be: a mirror held up to both the external world and the inner life. The visual arts flourished as well. Painters experimented with perspective and composition. Calligraphy became increasingly refined, each style, regular, running, cursive, representing different aesthetic ideals. Ceramic artists perfected techniques that produced pottery of remarkable delicacy and beauty. The famous Tang tricolor glazed pottery, with its flowing pattern of green, amber, and cream, captured something essential about the dynasty's aesthetic. Vibrant, confident, alive with movement. Women enjoyed unusual freedoms during this period, at least among the elite. They could own property, initiate divorce, and participate in public life in ways that would become restricted in later dynasties. The most remarkable example was Wu Zetian, who rose from being a concubine to become China's only female emperor, ruling in her own right from 690 to 705 CE. Her reign was controversial. She was ruthless in eliminating rivals, but also effective. The empire remained stable and prosperous under her rule, challenging assumptions about who could wield imperial power. The Tang military was formidable. Its armies, a mix of Chinese infantry and cavalry, recruited from Central Asian peoples. The empire could project power across vast distances, maintaining garrisons in remote regions, responding to threats with speed and efficiency. This military strength undergirded the Tang's diplomatic influence. Neighboring kingdoms sent tribute missions not because they were conquered, but because aligning with the Tang offered advantages. Trade access, cultural prestige, protection from other threats. Yet even at this height, subtle cracks were forming. The empire was vast, perhaps too vast. Communication across such distances was slow. Regional commanders gained autonomy simply from necessity. The very cosmopolitanism that enriched Tang culture also created tensions as different groups competed for influence. The Golden Age was real, but it contained within itself the seeds of future crisis. The Tang dynasty didn't just produce great poetry. It made poetry central to what it meant to be educated, cultured, civilized. To pass the civil service examinations, candidates had to demonstrate mastery of poetic forms. To participate in court life, officials were expected to compose verses at banquets and gatherings. Poetry wasn't a hobby or a specialty. It was a fundamental skill, like literacy itself. Li Bai embodied the romantic ideal. He wandered through mountains and rivers, writing verses that seemed to capture the essence of nature with effortless grace. His poems celebrated wine, friendship, and the beauty of the world. There's a story, probably apocryphal, that he drowned while drunk, trying to embrace the moon's reflection in a river. Whether true or not, it captures something essential about how he was remembered, as someone who lived fully, intensely, without concern for convention or consequence. Du Fu took a different path. Where Li Bai wrote about personal experience and natural beauty, Du Fu chronicled the age itself. His poems documented warfare, famine, and social injustice. He wrote about abandoned villages, about families torn apart by military conscription, about the gap between the court's splendor and the people's suffering. His work was more somber, more political, but equally masterful in its craft. Wang Wei offered yet another approach. He was both a poet and a painter, and his verses often read like landscape paintings rendered in words. His poetry emphasized stillness, contemplation, the subtle interplay of light and shadow. He was deeply influenced by Buddhism, and his work reflected that spiritual sensibility, a sense that true understanding comes through quiet observation rather than active engagement. These three poets, Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, represented different facets of Tang literary culture, but they shared certain qualities. Their work was technically sophisticated, following complex rules about rhyme, meter, and tonal patterns. Yet within these constraints, they achieved remarkable freedom of expression. The forms didn't limit them. They provided a framework within which creativity could flourish. Calligraphy was considered the highest art form, more prestigious than painting or sculpture. The way someone wielded a brush revealed their character, their education, their inner state. Each stroke was an expression of personality. The great calligraphers of the Tang period developed distinctive styles that were studied and imitated for centuries. Calligraphy wasn't just writing. It was a form of meditation, a spiritual practice, an art that united the physical act of creation with philosophical and aesthetic ideals. Painting evolved in new directions during this period. Artists moved away from depicting only human figures and began exploring landscape as a subject in its own right. Mountains, rivers, trees, mist, these became worthy subjects for serious artistic attention. The paintings weren't attempts at photographic realism. They were interpretations, expressions of how the artist understood the relationship between humanity and nature. Buddhist art reached new heights of sophistication. The cave temples carved during earlier periods continued to be expanded and refined. Sculptors created Buddha figures that combined spiritual serenity with remarkable technical skill. The flowing robes, the peaceful expressions, the perfect proportions, all demonstrated a mastery of form that served religious devotion. The Tang aesthetic valued elegance, restraint, and technical excellence. Whether in poetry, painting, or calligraphy, the goal wasn't to shock or provoke, but to achieve a kind of perfection within established forms. Innovation happened, but it happened within tradition, building on what came before rather than rejecting it. This conservative approach to art might seem limiting, but it produced work of extraordinary refinement and enduring beauty. The Tang dynasty's artistic achievements would influence Chinese culture for the next 1,000 years, establishing standards and ideals that subsequent generations would strive to match. The Golden Age ended not with a whisper, but with a roar. In 755 CE, a general named Lushan, commanding armies on the northern frontier, turned his forces southward and marched on the capital. He was a trusted commander, a man who had risen through the ranks despite his foreign origins. His father was Sogdian, his mother Turkic. The emperor had favored him, granted him authority over vast territories and hundreds of thousands of troops, and now he was using that power to tear the empire apart. And Lushan's rebellion wasn't born from ideology or principle. It was personal ambition mixed with court intrigue. He had cultivated relationships with powerful figures in Chang'an, including the emperor's favorite consort, Yang Guifei. But as factional rivalries intensified, Lushan found himself threatened by enemies at court who wanted to strip him of his command. Rather than wait to be destroyed, he struck first. His armies swept southward with shocking speed. The Tang military, accustomed to fighting nomads on the frontier, struggled to respond to a full-scale invasion led by one of their own best generals. Cities fell. The Imperial forces retreated. Within months, Lushan had captured Luoyang and declared himself emperor of a new dynasty. Chang'an itself was threatened. Emperor Xuanzong, who had presided over the dynasty's golden age, fled the capital with his court. The journey was desperate, chaotic. Supplies ran short. The emperor's guards, hungry and demoralized, blamed Yang Guifei for the crisis. She was related to one of Lushan's court enemies. They demanded her death. The emperor, powerless to protect even his beloved consort, agreed. She was strangled, and the emperor continued his flight westward, a broken man. The rebellion lasted 8 years, from 755 to 763 CE, though Lushan himself didn't survive to see its end. He was murdered by his own son in 757, and his son was murdered shortly after. The rebellion fragmented into competing factions, but the fighting continued, devastating northern China. The Tang eventually prevailed, but at an enormous cost. Millions died, from warfare, from famine, from disease that spread through disrupted regions. The population of the empire may have declined by as much as a third. Entire provinces were depopulated. Cities that had been prosperous centers of culture and trade lay in ruins. More importantly, the rebellion shattered the Tang dynasty's centralized authority. To defeat Lushan, the court had been forced to rely on regional military governors, granting them autonomy and resources. These governors, once the rebellion ended, didn't surrender their power. They became semi-independent warlords, acknowledging the emperor's authority in theory, but ruling their territories as personal domains in practice. The economic center of the empire shifted permanently southward. The Yangtze River Valley, which had been spared the worst of the fighting, now became China's heartland. The north, once the cradle of Chinese civilization, would take generations to recover. The Tang dynasty survived the Lushan rebellion, but it never recovered its former glory. The Golden Age was over. The empire limped forward for another century and a half, experiencing moments of recovery and renewal. But the fundamental damage had been done. The cycle was turning once more, and the mandate was slipping away. The dynasty that had seemed invincible at its height was now revealed to be as fragile as any that had come before. The Tang dynasty survived the Lushan rebellion, but survival isn't the same as thriving. The empire that emerged from 8 years of civil war was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. The centralized authority that had made the Tang great was gone, replaced by a patchwork of semi-autonomous military regions whose governors paid lip service to the emperor but answered to no one. These regional commanders, called jiedushi, controlled their own armies, collected their own taxes, and passed their positions to their sons. The emperor in Chang'an issued edicts that were ignored. The bureaucracy, once staffed by talented men selected through examinations, became increasingly corrupt and ineffective. Court eunuchs gained power, manipulating emperors and eliminating rivals. The system was rotting from within. The 9th century saw brief moments of recovery. Capable emperors occasionally emerged, implementing reforms and reasserting some measure of control. But these moments never lasted. The fundamental problems, regional autonomy, economic strain, court corruption, remained unresolved. Each reform effort exhausted itself against the weight of accumulated dysfunction. In 875 CE, a massive peasant rebellion erupted under the leadership of Huang Chao, a failed examination candidate turned salt smuggler. His forces swept across southern China, capturing city after city. In 880, they took Chang'an itself. The emperor fled, as his predecessor had during the Lushan rebellion. Huang Chao declared himself emperor of a new dynasty, though his control was tenuous and his rule brief. The Tang government eventually retook the capital, but the cost was devastating. To defeat Huang Chao, the court had relied even more heavily on regional military governors, granting them further autonomy. The empire was fracturing in all but name. Provincial commanders began openly defying imperial authority, declaring independence, or simply ignoring orders from Chang'an. The dynasty's final decades were a slow collapse. Different factions at court struggled for control, but it hardly mattered. Real power belonged to the regional warlords, and they had no interest in preserving a unified empire. In 907 CE, a military commander named Yuan forced the last Tang emperor to abdicate. The dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries was finished. What followed was the era of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, another period of fragmentation and chaos. Northern China saw 5 short-lived dynasties rise and fall in rapid succession, each claiming to be the legitimate successor to the Tang. In the south, 10 independent kingdoms emerged, each carving out its own territory. The cycle had turned once more. Unity had dissolved into division. Yet even in collapse, the Tang dynasty left an indelible mark. Its poetry, its art, its administrative systems, its cultural achievements, all would be remembered and emulated by later dynasties. The Tang had shown what Chinese civilization could achieve at its height. That memory would endure through the chaos to come, a reminder that unity was possible, that greatness could be reclaimed. The mandate had been withdrawn, but it would be granted again. The cycle continued its eternal turn. The chaos of the 5 dynasties period ended in 960 CE, when a general named Zhao Kuangyin seized power and established the Song dynasty. But Zhao learned from history. He understood that military strength alone couldn't create lasting stability. The Tang had been destroyed partly because regional military governors became too powerful, too independent. The Song would take a different path. Zhou, now Emperor Taizu, implemented a revolutionary policy. He elevated scholar officials above military commanders. The civil service examination system, which had existed for centuries, now became the primary route to power and prestige. Success in the examinations, not martial prowess or aristocratic birth, determined who governed China. This shift created a meritocracy that would define Chinese governance for the next millennium. The examinations were grueling. Candidates spent years memorizing Confucian classics, studying poetry, mastering calligraphy. The tests lasted days, with candidates locked in tiny cells, writing essays on governance, ethics, and statecraft. Only a small percentage passed, but those who did entered an elite class of scholar officials whose loyalty was to the emperor and the state, not to regional warlords or military factions. This emphasis on civilian governance had profound consequences. Military commanders found themselves subordinated to civilian administrators who often knew little about warfare. This would create problems when the Song faced external threats. But it also created internal stability. The cycle of military coups and regional rebellions that had destroyed previous dynasties was broken. The Song period witnessed an economic transformation unlike anything China had seen before. Agriculture became more productive through improved techniques and new crop varieties. The introduction of early ripening rice from Southeast Asia allowed farmers to harvest 2 crops per year instead of 1. Population grew rapidly, reaching perhaps 100 million by the 12th century. Cities expanded dramatically. Kaifeng, the Song capital, became one of the world's largest cities, home to over 1 million people. Its markets were vast and diverse. Its streets bustled with activity day and night. Urban culture flourished. Tea houses, restaurants, theaters, shops, selling everything imaginable. The Song created China's first true urban middle class, people whose wealth came from commerce rather than land ownership. Paper money became widespread during this period, a revolutionary innovation that facilitated trade on an unprecedented scale. Merchants no longer needed to transport heavy copper coins across long distances. They could conduct transactions with printed notes backed by the government. This monetization of the economy spurred commercial growth and made China the world's most economically advanced society. Maritime trade expanded dramatically. Chinese ships, among the largest and most sophisticated in the world, sailed to Southeast Asia, India, and even East Africa. The compass, perfected during the Song period, made long-distance navigation safer and more reliable. Ports like Guangzhou became international trading centers where merchants from across Asia gathered to exchange goods and ideas. Technological innovation flourished. The Song period saw advances in metallurgy, agriculture, and manufacturing. Movable type printing, invented by Shang around 1040, revolutionized the production of books. Knowledge that had once been confined to a small elite could now be disseminated widely. Printing presses produced everything from Buddhist sutras to technical manuals to popular literature. Yet, for all its economic and technological achievements, the Song dynasty faced a persistent military weakness. The scholar officials who governed the empire were brilliant administrators, but often poor strategists. The army, while large, was less effective than those of previous dynasties. This vulnerability would haunt the Song throughout its existence, as powerful nomadic neighbors, first the Liao, then the Jin, finally the Mongols, pressed against China's borders, demanding tribute, seizing territory, and eventually conquering the dynasty itself. But that conquest lay in the future, for now the Song represented something new in Chinese history, a dynasty whose greatness came not from military might or territorial expansion, but from economic vitality, technological innovation, and cultural sophistication. The cycle had turned once more, but this time toward a different kind of power. The Song dynasty's economic prosperity created space for cultural and intellectual pursuits on a scale China had rarely seen. Wealth alone doesn't produce great art or profound philosophy, but it provides the leisure necessary for both. Song China had that leisure in abundance, and its scholars, artists, and thinkers used it well. Movable type printing, invented by Shang around 1040, transformed how knowledge spread through society. Before this innovation, books were copied by hand or printed from carved wooden blocks, processes that were slow and expensive. Movable type used individual characters that could be arranged, printed, and rearranged for different texts. While the technology was more complex for Chinese characters than for alphabetic scripts, it still represented a revolutionary leap forward. Books became more accessible. Ideas could circulate more widely. The democratization of knowledge had begun. Painting reached new levels of sophistication during the Song period. Artists moved beyond depicting religious subjects or court scenes to explore landscape as a worthy subject in itself. Mountains rising through mist, rivers winding through valleys, trees bending in wind. These became the focus of serious artistic attention. The paintings weren't attempts at photographic realism. They were interpretations, expressions of how the artist understood the relationship between humanity and the natural world. Song landscape paintings often included tiny human figures dwarfed by vast mountains or forests. This wasn't a statement about human insignificance, but about perspective, the recognition that we exist within nature, not above it. The paintings invited contemplation, a quiet meditation on our place in the larger order of things. They were visual philosophy, rendered in ink and brushstrokes. Calligraphy continued to be revered as the highest art form. The Song period produced masters whose styles were studied for centuries afterward. Each brushstroke revealed something about the calligrapher's state of mind, their education, their character. Writing wasn't just communication. It was self-expression, spiritual practice, and aesthetic creation all at once. Neo-Confucianism emerged during this period, a philosophical movement that would dominate Chinese intellectual life for the next 8 centuries. The scholar Zhou synthesized Confucian ethics with elements of Buddhist and Taoist metaphysics, creating a comprehensive system of thought that addressed questions of cosmology, human nature, and moral cultivation. Neo-Confucianism emphasized self-discipline, education, and the perfectibility of human nature through study and practice. It provided an intellectual framework that justified the scholar official class's dominance, while offering ordinary people a path to moral improvement. Mathematics and astronomy advanced significantly. Song scholars made calculations of remarkable precision, developing techniques that wouldn't appear in Europe for centuries. They understood concepts like negative numbers and were working toward what we would recognize as algebra. Astronomical observations were detailed and accurate, used both for creating calendars and for astrological predictions that influenced government decisions. Medicine evolved as well. Physicians compiled encyclopedic works documenting symptoms, treatments, and herbal remedies. The understanding of the human body became more sophisticated, building on centuries of accumulated knowledge while incorporating new observations and theories. Traditional Chinese medicine, as we know it today, owes much to Song-era developments. Yet, alongside these intellectual achievements, the Song period saw the spread of practices that would later be condemned. Foot binding became increasingly common among elite families, a painful tradition that would persist for centuries. The practice reflected complex attitudes about beauty, status, and gender roles, a reminder that cultural sophistication doesn't automatically translate to moral progress. The Song dynasty created an environment where innovation flourished across multiple domains simultaneously. Economic prosperity, political stability, and a culture that valued education combined to produce a golden age of Chinese civilization. The dynasty's military weakness would eventually prove fatal, but its cultural and technological achievements would endure, influencing not just China, but all of East Asia for centuries to come. During the Song dynasty, scholars grappled with questions that had troubled Chinese thinkers for centuries. How should a person live? What is the nature of reality? How can society achieve harmony? The traditional answers, found in Confucian classics written over 1,000 years earlier, seemed insufficient. Buddhism and Taoism had introduced new concepts, new ways of thinking about the self and the cosmos. Could these different philosophical traditions be reconciled? Zhu Xi, a scholar living in the 12th century, believed they could. He spent decades studying the classics, meditating on their meanings, and developing a comprehensive philosophical system that would come to be known as Neo-Confucianism. His synthesis wasn't a rejection of traditional Confucianism, but an expansion of it, incorporating insights from Buddhism and Taoism while remaining grounded in Confucian ethics. At the heart of Neo-Confucianism was the concept of lie, principle, or pattern. Zhu Xi argued that everything in the universe, from the largest mountain to the smallest insect, embodied lie. This wasn't a mystical force, but an organizing principle, the pattern that made each thing what it was. A tree grew in a certain way because of its life. Water flowed downhill because of its lie. Human beings possessed moral intuitions because of their lie. But Li alone wasn't enough to explain existence. There was also Qi, material force or vital energy. Qi was the substance of things, the physical matter that took shape, according to Li. A piece of jade and a lump of coal both had Li, but their Qi was different, which was why they appeared and behaved differently. Everything in the world resulted from the interaction between Li and Qi, principle and matter. For human beings, this had profound implications. Each person possessed a nature that was fundamentally good. This was their lie, their inherent moral principle. But that nature could be obscured by Qi, by physical desires and emotional disturbances. The goal of moral cultivation was to clarify one's Qi, to remove the obstructions that prevented one's true nature from manifesting. How did one achieve this clarification? through study, self-reflection, and practice. Neo-Confucianism emphasized education not as mere accumulation of knowledge, but as a process of moral transformation. Reading the classics wasn't about memorizing texts. It was about understanding the principles they contained and applying those principles to one's own life. Meditation, borrowed from Buddhist practice, became a tool for quieting the mind and perceiving one's true nature. Neo-Confucianism also provided a framework for understanding social relationships and political order. Just as each individual had an inherent nature that needed cultivation, society had a natural order that needed maintenance. The 5 relationships, ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger, friend and friend, weren't arbitrary conventions, but expressions of cosmic principle. Fulfilling one's role in these relationships meant aligning oneself with the fundamental pattern of the universe. This philosophy had practical consequences. It justified the examination system by arguing that moral cultivation and scholarly achievement were inseparable. It reinforced social hierarchies by presenting them as natural rather than constructed. It emphasized family rituals and ancestor worship as essential practices for maintaining cosmic harmony. Zhu Xi's Neo-Confucianism became orthodox doctrine, taught in schools, tested in examinations, and accepted by scholar officials as the correct interpretation of the classics. It would dominate Chinese intellectual life for the next 7 centuries, shaping how educated people thought about everything from personal ethics to statecraft. The philosophy offered something rare, a comprehensive worldview that addressed both metaphysical questions and practical concerns, that united theory and practice, that made sense of the world while providing guidance for living in it. While Song China flourished in its cities and academies, a different kind of power was gathering on the northern steppes. The Mongols, a confederation of nomadic tribes, had long been divided into competing clans, their energies spent on internal feuds and raids against settled neighbors. But in 1206, a leader emerged who would unite these scattered peoples and unleash them upon the world. His name was Temujin, though history would know him as Genghis Khan. The Mongols weren't just another nomadic threat. Previous steppe peoples had raided Chinese borders, demanding tribute, occasionally conquering territory. But they had always been absorbed or pushed back. The Mongols were different. They combined traditional nomadic strengths, horsemanship, archery, mobility, with sophisticated military organization and ruthless strategic thinking. They learned from every enemy they fought, adapting tactics and incorporating technologies. They were, quite simply, the most effective military force the world had yet seen. Genghis Khan's armies swept across Central Asia with terrifying speed. Cities that resisted were utterly destroyed, their populations massacred as warnings to others. Cities that surrendered were spared, but stripped of wealth and incorporated into the growing Mongol Empire. By the 1230s, the Mongols had conquered the Jin dynasty in northern China, the same Jin who had earlier defeated and humiliated the Song. The question was no longer if the Mongols would attack the Song, but when. The Song dynasty watched these developments with growing alarm. They had relied on paying tribute to northern neighbors, using diplomacy and wealth to maintain peace. But the Mongols weren't interested in tribute. They wanted conquest, submission, incorporation into their empire. The Song's military weakness, which had been manageable when facing other Chinese states or traditional nomadic raiders, now became potentially fatal. Yet the Song had advantages the Mongols initially struggled to overcome. Southern China's geography, its rivers, rice paddies, and mountains, didn't favor cavalry warfare. The Mongols were masters of the open steppe, but rice paddies and river networks required different tactics. The Song also possessed sophisticated fortifications and naval forces. Their cities were well defended, their waterways patrolled by ships the Mongols had no experience fighting. The initial Mongol campaigns against the Song in the 1230s made limited progress. The invaders could win battles in open terrain, but they struggled to take fortified cities or control riverine regions. The Song, despite their military limitations, proved capable of defending their heartland. A stalemate developed, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. This stalemate gave the Song a reprieve, but it also created a false sense of security. The Mongols were learning, adapting, preparing. They began building their own naval forces, recruiting Chinese engineers to help them conduct siege warfare, studying the terrain, and developing new strategies. The pause in fighting wasn't peace. It was preparation. The Song dynasty continued its cultural and economic pursuits, as if the Mongol threat were just another challenge to be managed through diplomacy and defensive warfare. Scholars debated philosophy. Merchants traded across maritime routes. Artists created beautiful works. Life went on, brilliant and refined, while on the northern borders the most formidable military machine in human history prepared its final assault. The cycle was turning once more, and this time the change would come from beyond China itself, carried on Mongol horses across the steppes and into the heart of Chinese civilization. In 1271, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, declared the establishment of the Yuan dynasty. The name itself was carefully chosen. Yuan, meaning origin or beginning, suggested not conquest, but a new chapter in the eternal cycle of Chinese history. Kublai understood that ruling China required more than military force. He needed legitimacy, the appearance of continuity with the dynasties that had come before. The final conquest of the Song took another 8 years. The Song fought with unexpected tenacity, their naval forces in defensive positions slowing the Mongol advance. But by 1279, the last Song resistance had been crushed. For the first time in Chinese history, the entire empire, north and south, heartland and frontier, fell under foreign rule. The cycle had turned in a way it never had before. Kublai established his capital at Dadu, modern-day Beijing, rather than the traditional centers of Chinese power. This choice was symbolic. He was creating something new, an empire that encompassed not just China, but vast territories across Asia. China was the jewel of this empire, but it was not the whole of it. The Yuan dynasty ruled as part of a larger Mongol world system, connected to the other Khanates through trade, diplomacy, and family ties. The Mongols implemented a rigid social hierarchy. At the top were the Mongols themselves, a small ruling elite who held the highest positions of power. Below them were the Semu people, Central Asians, Persians, Turks, who served as administrators and merchants. The third tier consisted of northern Chinese, descendants of those who had lived under Jin rule. At the bottom were the southern Chinese, the former subjects of the Song, viewed with suspicion as potential rebels. This hierarchy created deep resentments, but it also brought unexpected benefits. The Mongol Empire's vast reach meant unprecedented opportunities for trade and cultural exchange. The Silk Road, which had existed for over a millennium, now operated under a single political authority from China to Persia. Merchants could travel with relative safety across distances that had once required navigating multiple kingdoms and paying tribute to numerous rulers. The Mongols called this the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant, traveled to China during this period and spent years in Kublai Khan's service. His accounts of China's wealth, sophistication, and scale captivated European readers. Whether or not all his stories were true, they revealed something important. China, under Mongol rule, remained a center of civilization, a place of wonders that Europeans could barely imagine. The Yuan period saw significant developments in drama and literature. The Zhou form of musical theater flourished, combining poetry, music, and performance in ways that influenced Chinese opera for centuries. These plays often featured ordinary people as protagonists, merchants, courtesans, scholars, rather than emperors and generals. They reflected the complex cosmopolitan society that had emerged under Mongol rule. Yet the Yuan dynasty never achieved the stability of previous dynasties. The Mongols remained a foreign presence, never fully integrated into Chinese society. Their rule depended on military force and the cooperation of Chinese administrators who served them out of pragmatism rather than loyalty. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, plagues struck with increasing frequency during the 14th century. The government's response was often inadequate, hampered by corruption and the vast distances information had to travel. By the 1350s, rebellions were erupting across China. The Red Turban movement, drawing on Buddhist millenarian beliefs, attracted followers who saw the Yuan's troubles as signs of cosmic disorder. The mandate of heaven was shifting once more. In 1368, a former peasant and Buddhist monk named Zheng led rebel forces that captured the Yuan capital. The last Yuan emperor fled north to Mongolia, and the Mongol chapter of Chinese history ended after less than a century of rule. The Yuan dynasty left complex legacies. It had expanded China's borders, connected the empire to global trade networks, and demonstrated that non-Han peoples could rule China. But it had also reinforced the idea that foreign rule was inherently unstable, that the mandate of heaven belonged to those who understood and honored Chinese traditions. The cycle continued its eternal turn, and once again, a new dynasty emerged from chaos, promising restoration and renewal. The Yuan dynasty's troubles began not with military defeat, but with nature itself. The 14th century brought a series of catastrophes that tested the empire's resilience. The Yellow River, China's mother river, had always been both blessing and curse. Now it became a destroyer. In 1344, the river changed course dramatically, flooding vast regions and displacing millions of people. Crops were destroyed. Villages vanished under muddy water. The government's response was slow and inadequate. Famine followed the floods. Without harvests, Without stored grain, people starved. The suffering was immense, but suffering alone doesn't topple dynasties. What matters is how rulers respond to crisis, and the Yuan government's response revealed its fundamental weaknesses. Corruption had spread through the bureaucracy. Officials hoarded relief supplies or sold them for profit. The court in Dadu seemed distant, disconnected from the devastation in the provinces. Then came the plague. The Black Death, which would soon ravage Europe, appeared in China during the 1330s. The disease spread through trade routes, carried by fleas on rats that traveled with merchant caravans. Cities were hit hardest, their dense populations creating perfect conditions for contagion. The death toll was staggering, though exact numbers remain unknown. Some regions lost half their population. These disasters might have been survivable with strong leadership and effective governance. But the Yuan court was paralyzed by factionalism. Mongol nobles competed for influence. Chinese officials maneuvered for position. The emperor was often a figurehead, real power wielded by competing cliques who cared more about their own advancement than the empire's welfare. Decisions were delayed or never made. Problems festered. In this environment of suffering and governmental failure, rebellion found fertile ground. The Red Turban movement began in 1351, drawing followers from desperate peasants who had lost everything to flood, famine, or plague. The movement blended Buddhist millenarianism with political grievance, promising both spiritual salvation and earthly justice. Its leaders claimed the Yuan had lost the mandate of heaven. That cosmic disorder reflected the dynasty's illegitimacy. The rebellion spread rapidly. Other uprisings erupted across southern China, some connected to the Red Turbans, others independent. Regional warlords emerged, carving out territories and building their own power bases. The Yuan military, once formidable, proved unable to suppress the spreading chaos. Mongol cavalry was effective in open warfare, but struggled against guerrilla tactics and fortified positions. Among the rebel leaders was Zhou Yuanzhang, a man of humble origins whose life story embodied the era's upheaval. Born to poor peasants, orphaned by famine, he had become a Buddhist monk simply to survive. But monasteries offered no refuge from the chaos. Zhou joined the Red Turbans, discovered he had a talent for leadership and military strategy, and gradually rose through the rebel ranks. By the 1360s, Zhou had consolidated control over much of southern China. He defeated rival rebel leaders, built an effective administration, and presented himself not as a revolutionary, but as a restorer of order. He understood that people craved stability more than radical change. In 1368, his forces captured Dadu. The last Yuan emperor fled north to Mongolia, where Mongol rulers would continue to claim the title of emperor for generations. But their rule over China was finished. The Yuan dynasty's collapse followed a pattern familiar from previous dynastic cycles: natural disasters, governmental incompetence, popular suffering, rebellion, fragmentation, and finally conquest by a new power promising restoration. The foreign origin of the Yuan rulers made their fall seem inevitable to many Chinese scholars, who saw it as proof that only those who understood Chinese culture could hold the mandate of heaven. The cycle had turned once more, and a new dynasty, the Ming, was about to begin. Zhou Yuanzhang entered Beijing in 1368, not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. He understood the power of symbolism, the importance of presenting his victory as the natural correction of cosmic disorder rather than mere military triumph. He took the reign name Hongwu, meaning vast military power, and declared the founding of the Ming Dynasty. The name Ming itself, meaning bright or brilliant, suggested the darkness of Mongol rule had ended. That light had returned to China. The new emperor faced an enormous task. Decades of warfare, famine, and plague had devastated the empire. Fields lay fallow. Cities were depopulated. The economy had collapsed. The administrative system had broken down. Hongwu needed to rebuild not just physical infrastructure, but the very idea of legitimate Chinese rule after a century of foreign domination. He began with land reform, redistributing property seized from Mongol nobles and wealthy landowners to peasant farmers. This wasn't ideological. Hongwu had no interest in social revolution, but practical. A stable agricultural base meant tax revenue, food security, and popular support. The emperor understood that dynasties fell when peasants starved, so he worked to ensure they didn't. The civil service examination system, which had continued under the Yuan, but with limited scope, was fully restored and expanded. Hongwu wanted officials selected for merit and learning, not birth or connections. The examinations tested knowledge of Confucian classics, ensuring that those who governed shared a common intellectual foundation. This created a bureaucracy that was, in theory at least, both competent and ideologically unified. But Hongwu's rule had a darker side. His peasant origins had taught him to trust no one, to see threats everywhere. He conducted massive purges of officials suspected of disloyalty, real or imagined. Entire families were executed. The use of brutal punishments, flogging, mutilation, death by 1,000 cuts, became common. The emperor justified this severity as necessary to root out corruption and establish order, but it created an atmosphere of fear that permeated the government. The capital was moved to Nanjing, in the south, closer to the Yangtze River Valley that had become China's economic heartland. The city was rebuilt on a grand scale, with massive walls, broad avenues, and impressive palaces. Later emperors would move the capital back to Beijing, but for now, Nanjing symbolized the dynasty's southern origins and its break with the Mongol past. Hongwu was deeply suspicious of foreign influence. He restricted trade, limited contact with other nations, and emphasized self-sufficiency. This isolationist tendency would characterize much of the Ming Dynasty, though it would be periodically challenged by those who saw value in engagement with the wider world. The Mongol experience had made many Chinese wary of foreign entanglements, fearful that openness led to vulnerability. The emperor also worked to restore traditional Chinese culture and values. Confucian rituals were emphasized. Ancestor worship was encouraged. The arts were patronized, though with the understanding that they should serve moral and political purposes. The Ming would become known for its cultural conservatism, its desire to preserve and perfect what had come before, rather than innovate radically. By the time of Hongwu's death in 1398, the Ming Dynasty was firmly established. The empire was stable, prosperous, and unquestionably Chinese once more. The cycle had turned, the mandate had been restored, and a new era had begun. The dynasty would endure for nearly 3 centuries, presiding over periods of great achievement and gradual decline, until it too would fall and the cycle would turn again. Between 1405 and 1433, something extraordinary happened. The Ming Dynasty, which had turned inward after overthrowing the Mongols, suddenly launched a series of massive naval expeditions that would dwarf anything Europe would attempt for another century. These weren't military conquests or trade missions in the conventional sense. They were demonstrations of power, exercises in diplomacy, and assertions that China remained the center of the civilized world. The man chosen to lead these expeditions was Zheng, a Muslim eunuch who had served the Mongol emperor since childhood. His selection was unusual but strategic. As a eunuch, he could never threaten the throne by founding his own dynasty. As a Muslim, he had connections to the maritime trading networks of Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. As a trusted servant of the emperor, he could be relied upon to represent imperial interests faithfully. The fleets themselves were staggering in scale. The largest ships, the treasure ships, measured over 400 feet long, larger than any European vessel of the time. Some accounts describe them as having 9 masts and carrying hundreds of crew members. Whether these descriptions were exaggerated remains debated, but even conservative estimates suggest ships far larger than anything Columbus would sail decades later. Each expedition included dozens of these massive vessels, accompanied by hundreds of smaller ships carrying soldiers, sailors, diplomats, and supplies. The total crews numbered in the tens of thousands. The first expedition departed in 1405, sailing south through the South China Sea, past Vietnam and Malaya, across the Indian Ocean to Ceylon and India. Subsequent voyages reached the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the coast of East Africa. Everywhere they went, the fleets presented gifts to local rulers, silk, porcelain, gold, and received tribute in return. The goal wasn't conquest, but acknowledgement, a recognition that China stood at the center of the world order. The expeditions brought back exotic goods, giraffes from Africa, which Chinese scholars identified as qilin, mythical creatures whose appearance was said to herald virtuous rule. They returned with precious stones, rare woods, medicines, and spices. But more importantly, they brought back diplomatic agreements, tribute missions, and the submission of foreign rulers to Chinese authority, at least in symbolic terms. Zheng He's Voyages demonstrated China's technological sophistication. The ships used magnetic compasses for navigation, watertight compartments for safety, and sophisticated rigging systems. The crews included astronomers who could navigate by the stars, interpreters who spoke multiple languages, and physicians who treated tropical diseases. These expeditions represented the cutting edge of maritime technology and organizational capability. Yet, in 1433, after the 7th voyage, the expeditions abruptly ended. The reasons remain somewhat mysterious. The official explanation involved cost. These fleets were enormously expensive to build and maintain. There were also ideological objections. Confucian scholars argued that such expeditions were wasteful, that China should focus on agriculture and internal development rather than foreign adventures. The military faced threats from Mongol tribes in the north, requiring resources that might otherwise fund naval expeditions. Perhaps most significantly, there was a fundamental question about purpose. What was China trying to achieve? The expeditions hadn't led to territorial conquest or significant trade profits. They had demonstrated Chinese power, but to what end? The tributary system already existed. Foreign rulers already acknowledged Chinese superiority, at least nominally. Why spend vast sums to sail across oceans when the same results could be achieved through traditional diplomatic channels? The decision to end the Voyages marked a turning point. China turned inward once more, focusing on internal development and border defense. The shipyards that had built the treasure fleets fell into disuse. Records of the voyages were destroyed or lost. Within a generation, the maritime technology and knowledge that had made the expeditions possible began to fade. By the time European ships arrived in Chinese waters a century later, China had largely abandoned the oceans it had once dominated.